Hello and welcome back to the Riverside Church Podcast, where our mission is to equip you to live out the gospel in everyday life. We're doing that in this series that we started 10 weeks ago now. We're in 10 or 11 weeks. We are in the book of Mark, looking at each chapter, mostly one chapter a week. And today we are in chapter 11. But before you watch the rest of this episode, go ahead and pause the video if you haven't already read Mark 11. Go ahead and read the whole chapter, and then we will talk about it as we go along. But if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you also like and share the video. Comment any questions you have, too, about this topic or other topics, and we'd be happy to address those.
Good. All right. Jumping right in. I hoped we would actually get here earlier because we're beginning the trek to the cross now.
Right.
And, of course, if you know the church calendar, we just came out of Easter just a couple of weeks ago. So a couple of weeks ago would have been an ideal time to be where we are right now, but that's okay. We're going to begin today with the triumphal entry, what we often call Palm Sunday. This is when Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so let's just jump right into it. Tell a little bit of the story. The story is Jesus sends the disciples ahead into Jerusalem, and he tells them that they're going to go into the village and they're going to find a colt tied there, and they're to get the colt and bring it to Jesus. And if anyone tries to stop them, just tell them that the Lord sent them to get it and that he'll give it back to him when he's done, which is interesting because one of the things we see is we see a little bit of Jesus, what I would call his prescience, that he knows what's going to happen. He knows ahead of time, like he knows that donkey's going to be there, and I doubt he snuck down into the village that night and arranged things. He just knew that was going to be there. But there's something really interesting here that's not part of the overall narrative we're going to look at today. But he says, if anybody asks you what you're doing, tell them that the Lord needs it, but then he's going to send it back. And what really strikes me about that is who you would assume that the person who's going to stop him is the person who owns the colt.
Right.
And he's giving the guy permission to say yes or no. So even though the Lord knows it's going to be there and he's in charge of all things, people still have will here,
right.
Will to say yes, which is kind of interesting. It's just a little free note there that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story. But anyway, so the overall question here is, again, I'm assuming that you read all this, so just jumping right in. Why does Jesus come riding into Jerusalem on a colt, on a donkey? It's the foal of a donkey.
You would think Jesus, the king of everything, king of Israel, riding in on a war horse. And
white horse and swords and soldiers and all that stuff. Why does he do it this way? Here's an interesting thing. Why first a colt that's never been ridden before? And so part of that goes back to the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus, in everything Jesus does, Jesus is fulfilling Scripture. He's fulfilling all the Scriptures that point to the coming of the Messiah. Now, the Jews didn't understand exactly. They were looking for a Messiah who'd come riding in. I said that really Southern. Messiah. A Messiah who would come riding into Jerusalem as a conquering king.
Right.
But the colt, the reason an animal that's never been ridden before is because anytime you're using animals for sacred purposes, you would never use animals that had been used before.
Right, it's like the spotless lamb and things of that nature.
Yeah, and so there's something to that. It's pointing to that idea of Jesus as the spotless lamb. But also, the reason Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey is to show what kind of king he is going to be. You may remember, if you've read the Old Testament, that King David came riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so Jesus is saying he is not coming to bring war, he's coming to bring peace. He's not coming as a conquering king, although he is coming as a king, but he's coming as a humble king who humbles himself, lowers himself to ride a donkey and not an instrument of war.
Well, and ultimately we see him conquering death. He's conquering death, not people.
Yeah, so his kingdom, and that's a great point that you're saying, his kingdom that he's bringing is not a physical kingdom, it's a spiritual kingdom. And so we see both his dignity and his humility. We see his royalty, but we also see that he's not a king that has come to command and demand, but a king who has come to conquer through love and grace and mercy. And so that's the kind of king that he wants to be. Now, it's interesting that he goes down into Jerusalem, and the first thing he does is go to the temple courts.
Yeah.
And he looks around, and it's interesting because only Mark, I think, I'm almost positive in this, only Mark depicts Jesus as going to the temple and then leaving. And then it's the next day that he actually cleanses the temple. Matthew kind of compresses it all together. I think in Matthew, he rides into Jerusalem and then he immediately cleanses the temple. And it's not that one is wrong and the other is right. Matthew's, they're more interested in what they're not always interested in all the details of the story. They're interested in the point that they're trying to convey.
Yeah.
And so Matthew is more conveying the idea of Jesus coming in. Yes, he's coming in humbly, but he's also going to come in and he's going to get rid of the.
He's going to clean house.
Yeah, but he doesn't do it right away, according to Mark. And I think there's some reasoning for it. He's number one. It's late in the day when he gets there, and so he comes in, he observes it, and then he leaves and he withdraws, and then we immediately go into this other story where it's the next day and they're leaving Bethany, they're heading back into Jerusalem, and Jesus sees a fig tree, and there's an interesting detail here. It says he sees a fig tree that's in leaves, or in leaf is the way the King James puts it. I think the NIV says that he sees a fig tree, it says he sees a fig tree in leaf, okay.
Yeah.
So fig trees are interesting among trees because, we live in a beautiful place where we live. And one of the things that we can count on this time of year, especially, besides allergies, of course, is that things are going to get green and then they're going to get colorful. They're going to get green because all the leaves come out on the trees. And then they're going to get colorful because all the trees go into bloom. Like if you have dogwoods, you're going to get all kinds of, white and pink and whatever. And depending on what trees, you can look up in the Blue Ridge Mountains right now and see all the different colors. But you're going to see green first. That's because in most trees, the leaves come first and then the blooms of the fruit come later. But fig trees are different. Fig trees actually bloom before the leaves come out. And so if you see a fig tree and it's in leaf, and the implication here is that it's full of leaves.
Right.
If it's full of leaves, then it has already bloomed. And so the assumption is going to be that there are going to be figs on it.
Right.
And so sometimes we read the story not understanding, and it's like, well, it's not the time of the year. It's still early, so there shouldn't be figs on it. He didn't see blooms. Interestingly enough, little useless knowledge for you. Did you know that the other interesting thing about fig trees is figs bloom inward?
Oh, yeah.
So the flower part of the fig is actually on the inside. And so when you eat a fig, you're actually eating the flower. That's the flower.
Yeah. Do you know how they're pollinated?
How's that?
With wasps.
Oh.
And so fig trees, like the actual fruit, the flower, the wasp goes into it and pollinates it and then dies. Or it goes into it, pollinates it, gives birth, and then dies. And then the little baby wasps fly out and go pollinate another fig.
I thought wasps had queens like everybody else.
No, so like they're fig wasps is what they are.
Oh.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
you
very
just taught me
interesting.
something I didn't know. There we go. All right. Science lesson for you.
There you go. I'm not sure if it's all figs, but it's certain types
Yeah,
of figs.
okay.
Yeah.
But so anyway, so the expectation is that they're going to be figs. If it's in leaf, then there are going to be figs on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus gets there, and there are no figs on the tree. And so he curses the tree. It's like you look at it and surface reading, you're like, wow, Jesus, this is uncharacteristic. Why? It's not the tree's fault that it's not bearing fruit, but is it? Mm. And that's the point, because anything Jesus does is purposeful.
Right. There's
always a lesson in it, and we're going to see the lesson as we progress later on. And so I want you to think about that. We're going to talk about this a little bit, but what happens next and then what the disciples ask him later all kind of go together. But so Jesus curses the fig tree, and he says to this fig tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." It says the disciples heard it. So why is Jesus so, beside the fact that he's hungry and there's no figs for him to eat? I mean, you could almost, if we didn't understand what he's actually doing here, you could almost accuse Jesus of like almost a sinful angriness here.
Right, just get angry for no reason.
Yeah, he's hungry and it won't give him fruit, and he's being petty,
right,
and cursing this tree. But there's a point, and the point is looking at what happened the day before. So Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. People are singing, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which Hosanna, by the way, is a word that means save us, deliver us. And that's exactly what Jesus came to do. It was not as a conquering king, but as a suffering Savior. Yep. He came to deliver his people. We almost skipped over that, didn't even talk about that. That's really important.
It's good to hit, yeah.
Yeah, and we preach about it a lot, maybe you know. But it's what happened at the end of that. He goes into the temple courts and he looks around. And what we're going to find out is he's not pleased with what he sees there.
Right.
Because the temple, and this may be hard for us to grasp maybe in our 21st century culture, because while I think the church is the center of a lot of what we do, I know my life centers around the church and the people and the church family and all that, but in the first century, the temple was like how we think of church being the center of what we do times 100.
Right.
Because the temple was the center of Jewish life. Everything spiritual happened at the temple. Now, they went to synagogue and where they heard teaching and they worshiped, but the temple was where their main religion happened. It's where sacrifices are made. It's where the priests served. It's everything major in Jewish life centered around the temple. And so if you're talking about bearing fruit, then the temple is where it happens. That's right. Where everything that God has designed for Israel is happening. They're making the sacrifices, whatever. And that's where everybody goes to offer their sacrifices, to give their offerings. And so Jesus gets there and he sees, yes, they're offering sacrifices, but you remember what Samuel said? He said, "To obey is better than sacrifice." Mm-hmm. And so they're doing all the stuff, but there's no real heart behind it.
Right.
But then they've also turned the temple into a money-making operation, because people are coming to give their offerings, but the temple will only accept shekels. Mm-hmm. You can't bring that dirty Roman money. And so if you go to the temple to bring your offering, then you have to get it exchanged. But they're charging you these exorbitant exchange rates. So, you may bring, I don't know, let's say $100 that you're going to throw in, but you have to exchange it to 100 shekels, but they're charging you $120 to get 100 shekels. And so Jesus sees that. He sees that they've turned it into a money-making operation. They're selling, all these animals and stuff, and for exorbitant rates, because they know people will pay for it because they want to obey God.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is angry about that. And so this fig tree is representative of what Jesus is seeing among his people, especially the leaders. They're a tree, but the tree is not bearing any fruit. Now, we're actually on Sunday mornings, we're in John chapter 15.
Yeah, very good.
And
parallel.
Jesus talks about it. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches, and my Father is the gardener. And any branch that does not bear fruit, he will prune out of the vine, and it will be thrown out to be burned.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're seeing in Jesus. He's seeing these people that are showing no real fruit, and he is so angry at what they have done to his Father's house. And so, in a sense, he's not taking it out on the fig tree. The fig tree is becoming the illustration that he's going to use to teach the spiritual lesson.
Yeah.
Now, what's going to happen, though? He immediately goes down to the temple after this, and he runs out the money changers, and he turns over their tables, and he, says, you've turned this is to be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of robbers.
Yeah.
And so, we see that here. It's stronger in some of the other Gospels, a little more played out. But the teachers of the law, now they're really angry, and they're looking for a reason to kill Jesus. And so evening comes, and Jesus and his disciples go out of the city. And as they're going out of the city, they see that fig tree that didn't have any fruit on it, that Jesus cursed, and they see that it is withered. And Peter remembers, and he says, Jesus, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. Now, I was thinking through this because you and I actually talked about this a little bit in my office today, just talking about what this fig tree means. And, I was equating that with what happened when he cleanses the temple.
Right.
But what he says next is also important, because there is hope even for withered fig trees. Because Peter says, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus says this, have faith in God, Jesus answered. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. And so what's he saying here?
There's, as long as you have faith, anything within God's will is possible.
Yeah, so let's equate this back to the fig tree. You can have not borne any fruit for God, but that does not mean that he is done with you. And so I think the point here, the reason these two are connected is, look, there's hope even for withered fig trees. If you have, maybe we've been that way. Maybe we've gone through the motions, and we've gotten in this rut of where we're doing all the religious things, where we're going to church, but we're not, and we're singing the songs, but we're not really worshiping. We feel dead, but we're going through the motions, and we're not really showing any fruit in our lives. Mm-hmm. Or maybe we've put on a show. We're guilty of we've been one who's put on a show, but there's not really any faith behind it. And so our life shows no fruit. Jesus is saying, look, you're not hopeless. If you will trust God by faith, then with faith anything is possible.
Yeah.
And even withered fig trees can bear fruit again. And so I think he's not saying there's no hope for Israel here. There's no hope for the Jewish people. But if they will return to God in faith, then anything is possible.
Yeah.
And I've never thought about that before until I really read this through. And because sometimes because the Bible's divided up into subheadings for us, which, by the way, weren't put there by Jesus or put there by the writers of the Gospels. Matthew didn't, add chapters and verses and subheadings. Those were added over 1,000 years later. Sometimes when we read Scripture, we separate things when we ought to read it continuously because things are more connected. And this is one of those places where I think sometimes we start our reading in verse 22 and we just think about that part of faith, but we're not connecting it to what came before.
For sure.
And so my point that I'm making, if you're watching this, is there is hope for withered fig trees. There is hope for people who aren't bearing fruit. But we also should fear God because he can cut us out of the vine if we're bearing no fruit for him.
I think maybe that's the point, is that like there's hope before you get withered.
Yeah.
There's hope before reaching that point. If you feel like you're not producing fruit, you feel like, you're estranged from God, just rely on God, have faith in him that he will produce that good work in you, and turn back to him.
Yeah.
I think, Brian, real quick, I think in the part of this where verse 18, where it says, chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. Jesus wasn't coming to condemn the people that were getting the abuse from this.
He's not condemning the people that are giving $120 to get $100 to give in an offering.
Right, and I think that's an important distinction because and oftentimes for leadership too, it's a warning that if we get too concerned about the budgets of our ministries and we have to be good stewards of that, obviously. But if we get too caught up in that as well and nickeling and diming every single thing and not trusting God and having faith that he will make a way, I think we can fall into that same trap, and that you almost lose the fruit just by pursuing the ministry and like operations,
So I think even beyond that, it's empty practice.
Right. Yeah.
Doing religious things with no heart behind it. And that's the issue with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the leaders. They're worshiping the law, they're not worshiping God.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, you guys you're missing the forest for the trees. You're so focused on like the outward stuff that the inward is just dead.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to the heart, and the heart is our faith, trusting in God, fearing God, yes, but also loving God, and loving God, the result is we love people as well. And so I think that's the point that we're getting to here. And of course, then they're going to find a way or try to find a way to catch Jesus. And I love how Jesus tends to come back with his responses. So they asked Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you authority to do this? Who gave you authority to grab a whip and drive out the money changers? Who gave you authority to turn over the tables? Who's giving you authority to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey? And I love what Jesus says. He says, I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. He's already said what authority he has. I mean, we looked at that in chapter 2.
Yeah.
He talks about that God has given him the authority to forgive sins.
Yeah.
And he is doing his Father's will. And so they just blatantly either don't want to believe him or don't believe him or whatever.
Trying to justify their actions.
But listen to what he says. He says, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Tell me. And they have this panic moment because they know that the people love John the Baptist.
Right.
And so they know that if they say from heaven, then he's going to ask, well, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, then they're afraid the people are going to be upset because they believe that John was really a prophet. And so they answer, we don't know.
It's a safe answer.
Yeah. Let me give the safe answer so that I don't have to give any answer at all.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. If you can't answer such a simple question, then I don't have to answer you either. Now, the point of this is Jesus doesn't answer to them.
Right.
The only person he answers to is God. And that's not to say that none of us, we're not ever accountable to any human authority, because that's not true. We submit to the authorities. The Bible makes that clear. But ultimately, my ultimate authority is God. And if let's say Seth is my boss, and Seth is telling me to do something that is unethical or unbiblical, my ultimate authority is God. And so my desire is to serve God more than to serve man. And if it's clear that God has told me to do something, then I'm not, and you're telling me to do the opposite, then I'm ultimately accountable to God first. Yep. All right. Any other thoughts before?
No, I think this is just a good example of faith and works. We can get so caught up in like either side that it's like, oh, just have faith, oh, just have works. That I think that's the whole problem between Israel at the time and what Jesus is coming to free people from. And it's not just a freedom from having to follow rules. It's a freedom in the rules. It's a fulfilling the law and the prophets. So I don't know. I love this passage. It's definitely one of those ones you can read like over and over and over again and miss the point. But hearing it this way is good.
Yeah, I think the point is obedience does not come from a list of commands that we obey. Obedience comes from a heart that is right with God.
Right.
So we obey because of what God has done for us. We don't obey to get into right relationship with God. And that's part of what was happening. But the other part of it is they simply were misusing God's name.
Yeah.
If you're talking about what the commandment, don't take the Lord's name in vain, that's in a sense what the leaders are doing here in Jerusalem. They are using God's name for profit.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is not about that. We have to produce the right kind of fruit, the fruit that will last. And so if we're not producing fruit that will last, that comes from a heart that's right with God, a heart that is thankful because of what God has done for us and in us through Jesus Christ, then we run the same risk of being the same way, of having just an empty religion that's devoid of real faith.
Mm.
And let's not be that way.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. Like we said earlier in the beginning of the podcast, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you are liking and subscribing to the channel. That really goes a long way towards helping us. It just also encourages us as we do this podcast and release more episodes to keep going. And, we're in it for the long haul, so we appreciate you guys watching and listening weekly. If you're watching on any other podcast networks like Spotify or anywhere else, you can go to riversideemc.org/podcast to get updates and more information there. We have several other past series that we've done, so if you like this and you want to hear more, you can find more there.
Good. All right. See you next time.